Hello and welcome to Nightmare Lullabies. As you settle in for the night, prepare to be immersed in a world of eerie whispers and unsettling tales, designed to both chill and soothe. Now, close your eyes, relax, and let the darkness carry you away. And if these nightly tales captivate you, feel free to join our community for more whispered secrets. On the morning of April 26, 1999, London awoke to the routine hum of city life. The streets were busy, the air carried the sounds of car horns and hurried footsteps, and people went about their usual business, unaware that one of the most shocking crimes in British history was about to unfold. At approximately 11:30 a.m., Jill Dando, one of Britain's most beloved television presenters, stepped out of her fiancé's home in Chiswick and drove toward her own house in Fulham, a quiet residential neighborhood in West London. She had no idea that in just minutes, her life would come to a sudden and violent end. Jill was a household name, a trusted journalist, and a former presenter of Crime Watch, a BBC program dedicated to solving crimes through public appeals. She had spent years in the spotlight, reporting on high-profile cases and bringing attention to victims who had yet to find justice. But on this fateful day, it was Jill herself who would become the center of an unsolved mystery. At 11:32 a.m., Jill pulled into the driveway of her modest home on Gowan Avenue. It had been months since she last visited. She had been living mostly with her fiancé, Alan Farthing, while they planned their wedding. She exited her car and walked up the steps to her front door, unaware that someone was waiting for her. What happened next remains a puzzle that has baffled detectives for over 2 decades. A single gunshot rang out. A neighbor, walking along the quiet street, heard what sounded like a scream, followed by a loud thud. But in the calm of an early afternoon, no one immediately suspected foul play. It was only when another neighbor happened to glance outside and saw Jill slumped against her front door that the horror of what had occurred became apparent. Police and paramedics arrived quickly, but there was little they could do. Jill had been shot once in the head at point-blank range. The method was swift, precise, and chillingly professional. The gunman had fired a single bullet, leaving her lifeless on her doorstep. By the time authorities arrived, the assailant had vanished without a trace. There were no witnesses who saw the shooter, no CCTV footage, and no forensic evidence left behind. It was as if the killer had appeared and disappeared in mere moments, leaving behind a crime that seemed more like an execution than a random act of violence. The news of Jill's murder spread rapidly, sending shockwaves through Britain. How could such a high-profile figure, a journalist known for reporting on crime, be targeted in such a brutal manner? The speculation began immediately. Was this a robbery gone wrong? A stalker? A professional hit? Or was it something even darker? Scotland Yard launched what would become one of the largest homicide investigations in British history. Over 2,500 potential suspects were questioned, thousands of leads were pursued, and yet, the case grew colder with each passing day. In the coming weeks, theories would emerge, some plausible, others outlandish. Was Jill targeted because of her work on Crime Watch? Was it a revenge killing? A political assassination? Or was the answer much closer to home? The search for answers had begun, but the deeper authorities dug, the more elusive the truth became. This was just the beginning of a mystery that, to this day, remains unsolved. The immediate aftermath of Jill Dando's murder sent shockwaves, not only through the media world, but also through law enforcement. Scotland Yard knew they were dealing with a crime unlike any other. A cold, calculated execution of a high-profile journalist in broad daylight, on her own doorstep, in a quiet residential neighborhood. The brutality and precision of the attack made one thing clear. This was no ordinary crime. In the hours following the discovery of Jill's body, forensic teams swarmed Gowan Avenue. They carefully examined the crime scene, hoping to find even the smallest trace of evidence that could lead them to the killer. But their findings only deepened the mystery. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of forced entry. No footprints or DNA were found near the scene. The single bullet that killed Jill was recovered, but it provided little insight into the identity of the shooter. The firearm itself was never found. The most chilling discovery was the method of execution. Jill had been shot with what was later determined to be a 9mm caliber bullet, fired from a modified handgun with a silencer. The bullet was fired at point-blank range, execution style, into the left side of her head. It was a method commonly associated with professional assassinations rather than random street crimes. Investigators knew they were dealing with something highly unusual. A targeted hit? A personal vendetta? A professional contract killing? The possibilities were endless, but the evidence was minimal. Within 24 hours of Jill's murder, Scotland Yard established a hotline to receive information from the public. Calls flooded in, ranging from vague tips to more concrete leads. A few stood out. A blue Range Rover was seen speeding away from the area shortly after the shooting. A man was spotted running from the crime scene around the time of the murder. Several people reported seeing a suspicious man loitering near Jill's home in the days leading up to her death. Detectives pursued these leads relentlessly, but none led to a definitive suspect. Witness descriptions varied. Some described the running man as a well-dressed individual in his late 30s, while others claimed he was wearing a dark coat with a hood pulled over his head. None of the sightings matched with anyone known to be in Jill's life. The press wasted no time speculating on who could have wanted Jill dead. Numerous theories began to dominate both tabloids and serious investigative reports. Some believed it was the work of an obsessed stalker who had taken their obsession to a violent extreme. Jill was a beloved TV presenter with many admirers, but no known stalkers had ever been reported, and she had never mentioned any concerns about her safety. Others believed it was a professional hit, given the execution-style killing, the lack of forensic evidence, and the swift getaway. Theories of political motivations emerged, linking her murder to her coverage of NATO's bombing of Serbia during the Kosovo War, suggesting it could have been an act of revenge against Britain. There were also those who pointed to her work on Crime Watch, suggesting that someone she had indirectly exposed may have sought revenge. Despite these theories, investigators struggled to connect any of them to concrete evidence. Jill Dando's murder sent a wave of fear across London. If someone as high-profile and respected as Jill could be gunned down in broad daylight, who else was at risk? The randomness of the crime made it even more terrifying. There was no forced entry, no burglary attempt, and no apparent connection to gang violence. It seemed as if Jill had been chosen at random, or worse, meticulously planned by someone who had been watching her for a long time. By the end of the first month of the investigation, over 1,000 people had been interviewed, but no arrests had been made. Scotland Yard faced mounting pressure from the public and the media to deliver results. Detectives remained hopeful that one piece of evidence would eventually emerge to break the case wide open. And then a breakthrough came. On May 25, 2000, over a year after Jill's murder, police arrested Barry George, a 40-year-old man with a history of criminal behavior and erratic tendencies. He lived just a short distance from Jill's home and had a past riddled with minor offenses, including stalking women and impersonating police officers. Barry George quickly became the prime suspect. His home was searched, and officers found a single particle of gunshot residue on one of his coats. Prosecutors argued that this linked him to the crime, and in 2001, he was convicted of Jill Dando's murder and sentenced to life in prison. For a moment, it seemed as though justice had been served. The public felt some relief, believing that the dangerous individual who had killed Jill had finally been caught. But the case was far from over. Barry George maintained his innocence, and his conviction would not stand the test of time. In the years to come, questions would arise about the evidence used against him, leading to one of the most controversial legal battles in modern British history. The case of Jill Dando was far from closed. Barry George's conviction was meant to bring closure, but from the moment the verdict was announced, doubts emerged about the reliability of the evidence. To some, it seemed like an open and shut case. A man with a troubling past, a history of erratic behavior, and a proximity to the crime scene was found to have gunshot residue on his coat. But to others, including many legal experts, the case felt rushed, the conviction built on circumstantial evidence rather than irrefutable proof. As appeals mounted, the foundation of the prosecution's case began to crumble. The single particle of gunshot residue was called into question, with forensic experts arguing that it could have been transferred from another source and did not conclusively prove that George had fired a gun. His past behavior, while unsettling, did not directly connect him to the crime. There was no DNA evidence, no eyewitness testimony placing him at the scene, and no weapon recovered. As the legal battle raged on, media coverage shifted from celebration to skepticism. The idea that Barry George had been convicted largely because of his reputation rather than concrete evidence gained traction. Public opinion became divided, with some believing he was guilty, while others saw him as a scapegoat, convicted for the sake of closing a high-profile case. In 2007, after years of appeals, the Court of Appeal ruled that the forensic evidence used against Barry George was unreliable. The conviction was overturned, and a retrial was ordered. The prosecution, lacking strong evidence, struggled to build a convincing case. In 2008, Barry George was acquitted of all charges. After spending 8 years behind bars, he walked free, but his name remained forever linked to a crime he insisted he did not commit. With Barry George exonerated, the Jill Dando case was back to square one. Nearly a decade had passed since her murder, and the investigation had lost momentum. The police revisited old leads, hoping that forensic advancements might yield new clues. Yet, despite their efforts, no new suspects emerged. The initial theories resurfaced, each with its own set of unanswered questions. Could Jill have been targeted by an unknown stalker who had watched her movements and seized the opportunity? If so, why had there been no prior threats, no suspicious activity reported? A professional hit remained a possibility, given the precision of the killing and the complete lack of forensic evidence. If it had been an assassination, however, the motive remained elusive. Who would want Jill dead, and why? The Serbian mafia theory continued to intrigue investigators, as Jill had been a vocal supporter of the NATO intervention in Kosovo, but intelligence agencies found no concrete links between her death and any organized crime group. As time passed, the lack of progress led to growing frustration. Jill's colleagues and family members remained hopeful that one day, the truth would emerge, but as the years turned into decades, the chances of solving the case grew increasingly slim. Cold case units periodically reviewed the evidence, but each time they encountered the same roadblocks: no DNA, no witnesses, no clear motive. The case faded from daily headlines, becoming a tragic chapter in British criminal history. For those who had known Jill, the lack of justice was a painful wound that never fully healed. Her fiancé, Alan Farthing, withdrew from the public eye, trying to rebuild his life away from the shadow of her murder. Her colleagues at the BBC continued to honor her legacy, but the unanswered questions remained. The murder of Jill Dando remains one of the most perplexing crimes in British history. With no solid suspects, no clear evidence, and no confirmed motive, it continues to baffle investigators and the public alike. Could the killers still be out there, living their life undetected? Did they act alone, or was there a larger conspiracy at play? These are questions that may never be answered. Despite the passage of time, the case remains open, a reminder of how even the most high-profile murders can slip through the cracks of justice. Jill's legacy, however, endures. She was more than just a television presenter. She was a journalist who dedicated her career to bringing truth to light. And in that spirit, the search for answers continues, even as the mystery remains unsolved. Years passed, and Jill Dando's murder remained one of the most confounding mysteries in modern British history. The lack of new evidence, the failed conviction of Barry George, and the absence of clear suspects left investigators with few leads. Yet, despite the fading media attention, Scotland Yard's cold case unit never fully abandoned the search for the truth. The case, still officially open, was periodically reviewed using advancements in forensic science. With every technological leap, there was renewed hope that something, anything, might be uncovered that had been previously missed. DNA analysis had improved dramatically since 1999, but Jill's crime scene had yielded no biological traces. The weapon had never been recovered. The suspect had seemingly left no trace behind. As investigators re-examined the case files, they once again turned their focus toward Jill's final movements. The way she was killed, one precise shot, no struggle, no evidence, continued to suggest a professional execution. The killer had approached undetected, fired a single shot to the head, and left without a trace. If it had been a random act of violence, it was one executed with an eerie level of planning and efficiency. One theory that continued to circulate involved the possibility of an unknown stalker. Jill was a public figure, well-loved and recognized by many. Had someone harbored an unhealthy obsession with her? Could it have been an admirer turned violent? But no evidence of direct threats had ever surfaced. No known stalkers had been reported. If someone had been watching Jill, they had done so without drawing any attention to themselves. The possibility of a professional hit lingered. Some speculated that her work on Crime Watch, the BBC program dedicated to solving unsolved crimes, might have made her a target. Had she unknowingly provoked someone dangerous? But this theory had its flaws. Jill was not an investigative journalist exposing criminal networks. She was a presenter, a public face of the program rather than someone directly involved in police investigations. There were no indications that she had received threats related to her work. If this had been a targeted assassination, why Jill? Why not one of the journalists actively working on investigative crime reporting? Another theory involved a botched robbery attempt. Could a criminal have been waiting near her home, intending to force their way inside? If that were the case, why wasn't anything stolen? There were no signs of a struggle, and Jill's purse remained untouched. The precision of the attack, one bullet point-blank range, was far from the panicked actions of a typical mugger. The most controversial theory remained the one involving international retaliation. Some speculated that her murder was linked to Britain's involvement in the NATO-led bombing campaign in Serbia, which had taken place just weeks before her death. Jill had presented an appeal for aid to Kosovan refugees on television, and some believed this had made her a target. Intelligence reports had initially investigated this theory, but no solid evidence had ever been found to link her killing to Serbian operatives. The theory persisted, but like all the others, it was riddled with unanswered questions. As time went on, the case became one of Britain's most famous unsolved crimes, drawing comparisons to other notorious mysteries. Despite its high profile, the years provided no further clarity, and leads continued to dry up. Periodically, investigators would receive tips, some credible, others clearly the work of attention seekers. But none led to a breakthrough. Jill's family, particularly her brother Nigel Dando, continued to advocate for justice. While they remained hopeful, the lack of progress weighed heavily on them. The years had not dulled their grief, and the unanswered questions remained as painful as ever. Who had waited for Jill that morning? Who had pulled the trigger? Who had slipped away without a trace? With every passing year, the likelihood of solving the case diminished. Those who might have known something had either remained silent or taken their secrets to the grave. The murderer, if still alive, had managed to evade capture for decades. And yet, the case was never officially closed. Scotland Yard continued to hold out hope that new forensic techniques, or an unexpected confession, might one day bring the truth to light. Jill Dando's legacy lived on, both in journalism and in the memories of those who had loved her. She was more than just a victim of an unsolved crime. She was a pioneer in British broadcasting, a woman whose warmth and intelligence had touched millions. Her murder remains a stark reminder of how even the most public figures can become the subject of mysteries that may never be fully unraveled. As the case remained open, so did the questions. And until the day came when the truth was finally uncovered, the mystery of Jill Dando's murder would continue to haunt the nation. Despite the years that had passed since Jill Dando's murder, the case never truly faded from public memory. Every anniversary of her death brought renewed media coverage, fresh speculation, and a painful reminder to her loved ones that justice remained elusive. For those closest to her, the grief had never fully subsided. The loss of someone so vibrant, kind, and beloved left a void that could never be filled. But even as memories dimmed and new headlines replaced old ones, investigators never fully abandoned the case. Detectives working in cold case divisions periodically reviewed the evidence, hoping that advancements in forensic science might yield something that had previously been overlooked. The problem was that Jill's murder was one of the most forensically barren crime scenes in modern history. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no CCTV footage, and no clear eyewitness accounts. The killer had seemingly vanished into thin air. What made the case even more frustrating was that despite its high profile, no one had come forward with new, credible information. If someone had planned Jill's murder, they had done so with meticulous precision and without leaving a trace of their identity. One of the most haunting aspects of the case was the sheer lack of motive. Many high-profile crimes are linked to personal vendettas, financial disputes, or organized crime, but none of these seem to apply to Jill. She had no known enemies. She was not involved in controversial journalism. She had never publicly received threats. The randomness of her murder suggested one of two possibilities. Either it was an act of opportunity by a lone individual with no discernible connection to her, or it was an expertly orchestrated assassination for reasons that remain unknown. In the years following Barry George's acquittal, some investigators revisited earlier theories. Could a professional hitman have been hired? The manner of Jill's execution, a single gunshot to the head at close range, was reminiscent of contract killings. However, contract killings usually involve individuals with ties to organized crime, corruption, or espionage. None of those connections existed in Jill's life. Yet the killer had displayed a level of expertise that suggested prior experience with firearms and targeted executions. If it had been a professional who had ordered the hit, and why? A more unsettling theory suggested that Jill's murder was entirely random, carried out by an unknown individual who had no personal reason to target her, but was driven by darker compulsions. Serial killers often leave calling cards, patterns, or evidence of past crimes, but no such trail emerged in Jill's case. If a disturbed individual had committed the crime, they had done so once and never again. At least, not in a way that connected them to Jill's murder. If it had been an obsessed stalker, as some suggested, they had done an extraordinary job of evading detection, never making their presence known before or after the crime. The theory involving international retaliation continued to circulate among conspiracy theorists and some investigators, though it remained one of the most difficult to prove. If a foreign intelligence agency or a paramilitary group had been involved, it would explain the professional nature of the killing. But without a direct claim of responsibility or any solid intelligence linking Jill's death to foreign operatives, it remained just that, a theory. One that, like all the others, lacked the evidence to be pursued further. As the case languished in uncertainty, Scotland Yard continued to appeal for new information. Over the years, several individuals came forward claiming to have knowledge about the crime, but each tip led to a dead end. Some were well-meaning but misinformed. Others were attention seekers hoping to insert themselves into a case that had captured the nation's imagination. Each time a lead emerged, investigators followed it diligently, only to find themselves back at the same frustrating dead end. Jill's friends and colleagues held on to hope that, one day, the truth would emerge. But as time passed, the likelihood of new evidence being uncovered dwindled. Key witnesses aged or passed away, memories blurred, and the ability to reconstruct the events of that fateful day became increasingly difficult. The only certainty was that someone somewhere knew what had happened. Whether that person would ever come forward remained the ultimate question. Jill Dando's legacy, however, endured. Her work in journalism and charity continued to inspire those who had known her, and her impact on British broadcasting remained immeasurable. Though her life was tragically cut short, her memory lived on in the people she had touched and the work she had done. But the unanswered questions remained, lingering like a shadow over an otherwise bright legacy. Who had waited for Jill outside her home that day? Who had pulled the trigger? And why had they disappeared so effortlessly, leaving behind only mystery and grief? For now, the case of Jill Dando remained open. A mystery without resolution, a crime without justice. And until the day came when the truth was finally uncovered, the echoes of that fateful morning on Gowan Avenue would continue to haunt those seeking answers. As the years continued to pass, Jill Dando's murder became more than just an unsolved case. It became a ghost that haunted the corridors of British law enforcement. Detectives who had initially worked the case retired, replaced by younger officers who inherited a mystery with no clear path forward. Despite the lack of progress, the investigation never truly closed. The unanswered questions still lingered, and each passing year only deepened the frustration felt by those who sought justice. One of the biggest obstacles to solving the case remained the complete absence of forensic evidence. In most murder investigations, even the most careful killers leave behind something. A stray hair, a fingerprint smudged on a surface, a fiber from their clothing. But Jill's crime scene was eerily sterile. No usable DNA was ever found. No trace of the killer's presence beyond the single bullet that had ended her life. The sheer lack of forensic clues suggested meticulous planning. Whoever was responsible had ensured that they left nothing behind. Cold case detectives often revisited Jill's final hours, trying to reconstruct her movements and interactions leading up to that fateful moment on Gowan Avenue. She had spent the night before with her fiancé, Alan Farthing, before heading to her own home that morning. She had no scheduled meetings, no public appearances, and no known threats looming over her. It seemed as though she had simply walked into an ambush. The killer had either been waiting for her or had followed her there. Some investigators speculated that the murder had been planned with military-style precision. The use of a silencer, the single fatal shot, and the rapid disappearance all pointed to someone who knew what they were doing. If this were the case, then the likelihood of a random attacker diminished even further. This was not the work of an opportunistic criminal. It was someone who had calculated every move in advance. But if it was an execution, then for what reason? Who would benefit from Jill Dando's death? Over the years, multiple individuals came forward with claims of having knowledge about the murder. Some insisted that they had overheard confessions, while others believed they had seen suspicious activity near Jill's home on the day of the crime. Yet, none of these accounts led to any concrete breakthroughs. Either the information was too vague, or it had been tainted by the passage of time. Memories fade, details become distorted, and what seemed like a crucial clue often turned out to be nothing more than speculation. One of the most confounding aspects of the case was the absolute lack of a clear motive. If Jill had been the victim of a contract killing, there was no evidence that anyone had ordered such an act. If she had been targeted due to her role on Crime Watch, there was no history of threats, and no criminals she had helped to expose had ever been linked to her murder. The idea of a political assassination, possibly connected to the events in Kosovo, remained an intriguing possibility, but again, no concrete evidence supported this theory. The randomness of it all was what made the case so haunting. Jill Dando was a well-respected journalist, a warm and kind-hearted person with no known enemies. Why her? Why that day? Why in such a calculated manner? Despite continued appeals for information, the case remained at a standstill. The conviction and subsequent acquittal of Barry George had been the only major development, but with his exoneration, the investigation had reset to square one. Scotland Yard continued to encourage the public to come forward with any new details, but the leads had dried up. The people who might have known something had either chosen to remain silent or had long since disappeared from the picture. For Jill's family and friends, the lack of resolution was the hardest part. They had lost someone they loved in a senseless act of violence, and the inability to find answers only compounded their grief. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, media outlets revisited the case, hoping that renewed interest might spark fresh information. But with each passing year, the likelihood of finding the truth seemed to dwindle. As technology advanced, there was still hope that new forensic techniques could yield results that had previously been impossible. DNA analysis was more sophisticated than ever, and investigative techniques had evolved. But whether or not these advancements would ever uncover the identity of Jill Dando's killer remained unknown. Until that day came, if it ever did, her murder would remain an enduring mystery, one that continued to cast a long, unsettling shadow over British crime history. As time wore on, the Jill Dando case became synonymous with Britain's greatest unsolved mysteries. Detectives and journalists alike continued to revisit the case, hoping that some overlooked detail, some hidden truth might emerge. The investigation had spanned more than 2 decades, and yet, the person responsible for Jill's murder had never been identified. The lack of resolution had not deterred investigators from continuing their efforts. Every few years, new forensic technologies were applied to old evidence, but no new breakthroughs were made. The crime scene had been frustratingly clean, and the absence of forensic traces had left law enforcement with very little to work with. For Jill's family, the pain remained raw. Her brother, Nigel Dando, had continued to speak publicly about his sister's case, keeping her memory alive in the hopes that one day, justice would be served. Yet, with each passing year, hope seemed to fade. The lack of closure was an unbearable burden, a wound that refused to heal. Despite the lack of new leads, one undeniable fact remained. The person who had pulled the trigger was still out there. If they were alive, they had been living in the shadows for over 20 years, carrying the knowledge of what they had done. The nature of Jill's murder made it difficult to believe that it had been the work of an amateur. The calculated precision of the crime, the lack of forensic evidence, and the immediate disappearance of the perpetrator all pointed toward a planned, intentional act. If the killer had remained silent all these years, it was likely they had planned every aspect of the crime in such a way that they were confident they would never be caught. The role of the media in Jill's murder investigation had been both a blessing and a curse. While the widespread coverage kept the case in the public eye, it also led to rampant speculation and numerous false leads. Countless theories had been put forth, ranging from plausible to entirely fantastical. There were those who believed Jill had been murdered as part of an international conspiracy, possibly due to her work as a journalist. Others suspected a personal vendetta, though no one in Jill's personal or professional life had ever emerged as a viable suspect. And then there were those who still believed it had been a completely random act, a tragic case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. One particularly persistent theory involved the possibility that Jill had been targeted by an unknown individual with a grudge against the BBC. As one of the network's most prominent presenters, she had been the face of programs that reached millions of viewers. Some speculated that a disgruntled former employee or an aggrieved viewer may have harbored resentment strong enough to commit murder. However, extensive background checks into individuals who had made complaints against the network yielded no clear suspects. If there had been a disgruntled individual, they had managed to stay completely off law enforcement's radar. A chilling aspect of the case was how little resistance Jill had been able to put up. It was believed that she had been caught completely off guard, possibly approached from behind. The method of execution, a single shot to the head at close range, was both efficient and brutal. It was over in seconds, leaving Jill with no chance to react, no opportunity to cry out for help. Neighbors reported hearing what they initially mistook for a scream, but it was later determined that this had likely been an involuntary reflex caused by the gunshot impact. The entire attack had taken less than a minute, and within moments, the killer had vanished. Jill's fiancé, Alan Farthing, had also endured years of scrutiny. Though he had a rock-solid alibi and had been completely cooperative with investigators, the nature of high-profile murder cases meant that those closest to the victim were often looked at with suspicion. However, there was never any evidence to suggest Alan had any involvement, and the focus of the investigation eventually shifted entirely away from him. Still, he had to live with the pain of losing the woman he had planned to marry, and the lack of answers made it all the more devastating. Every so often, Scotland Yard would issue fresh appeals for information, hoping that someone who had been silent for years might finally come forward. Detectives remained convinced that there was someone out there who knew more than they were saying. Whether it was an eyewitness who had never spoken, an accomplice who had remained silent, or even the killer themselves struggling with the weight of their crime, the possibility of new information always lingered in the background. The murder of Jill Dando was not just a crime against an individual, it was a crime that shook a nation. It reminded the public of how fragile safety could be, how even someone as well-loved and respected as Jill could become a victim of senseless violence. The years had done little to ease the questions that haunted those who had known her, who had waited for her that day, who had fired that single devastating shot, and most of all, why. Despite the passage of time, the case remained open, and the search for the truth continued. Until the day came when justice was finally served, Jill Dando's murder would remain one of the most haunting mysteries in British criminal history. The passing years had done little to diminish the intrigue surrounding Jill Dando's murder. Each anniversary brought a fresh wave of media coverage, stirring up old theories and igniting renewed speculation about the identity of her killer. Yet, despite the periodic surges of interest, the case remained as frustratingly unsolved as it had been on the day she was killed. Investigators had long accepted that the chances of solving the case dwindled with each passing year. People who might have held key information had either forgotten details or were unwilling to come forward. Potential witnesses had either passed away or moved on, taking their knowledge with them. However, there was always hope that a new forensic breakthrough, a confession, or a forgotten piece of evidence might emerge to bring long overdue justice. The reality was that Jill's murder had become a case study in how difficult it could be to solve a crime when the perpetrator left no physical trace behind. The forensic advancements that had revolutionized criminal investigations over the years had not been able to provide answers because there was simply no DNA, no fingerprints, and no material evidence left at the crime scene. The weapon used in the attack had never been recovered, and without a suspect in custody, it had never been possible to compare ballistics with any known firearm. The case remained trapped in an agonizing limbo, always on the verge of discovery, but never quite crossing the threshold. Despite the lack of concrete progress, investigators had never given up on trying to unearth new leads. Over the years, Scotland Yard had periodically reassessed the evidence, looking for anything that could have been missed. Every now and then, new individuals came forward claiming to have knowledge about the case. Some claimed to have overheard confessions, while others insisted they had seen a suspicious figure near Jill's home on the morning of her murder. But none of these statements had ever led to anything conclusive. Each time a potential lead arose, it inevitably led to another dead end. One of the persistent frustrations for investigators was the randomness of the crime. Most murders have clear motives: jealousy, revenge, financial gain. But Jill's case defied easy explanation. She had no known enemies. There were no signs of an attempted burglary. If her murder had been the result of a personal vendetta, the person responsible had left no trace of their involvement. This led to theories that Jill had been the victim of a contract killing, executed with the precision of a trained assassin. But if that were the case, who had ordered it, and for what reason? The Serbian mafia theory had remained a topic of discussion among investigators and journalists. Some believed that Jill's murder was a form of retaliation for NATO's bombing of Serbia, which had occurred weeks before her death. Jill had presented an appeal on behalf of Kosovan refugees, and some theorized that she had been targeted as a result. However, no intelligence agencies had ever been able to link her death to Serbian operatives, and the theory remained speculative at best. Another theory that continued to intrigue investigators was the possibility that Jill had been killed by someone with a deep-seated obsession. Celebrities often attract the attention of individuals who fixate on them, sometimes with dangerous consequences. If Jill had been targeted by a stalker, it was possible that the person responsible had harbored their obsession in secret, never leaving behind any prior threats or messages that would have alerted authorities to their presence. The chilling thought that someone could have been following Jill, waiting for the right moment to strike, was one that haunted those who sought answers. The passage of time did not diminish the pain felt by Jill's family and friends. For them, the case was not just an unsolved crime, it was a lingering source of grief and unanswered questions. Jill Dando, Jill's brother, continued to advocate for justice, refusing to let the case fade into history. He remained hopeful that someone somewhere held the missing piece of the puzzle that would finally lead to the killer's identification. He had always believed that there was a person out there who knew more than they had let on, someone who might have witnessed something crucial, but had remained silent for reasons unknown. Jill's fiancé, Alan Farthing, had struggled with the loss in his own way. Their wedding had been just months away when she was killed, and the pain of losing her so suddenly had left an indelible mark on his life. He had largely retreated from the public eye, choosing to grieve privately rather than becoming a spokesperson for justice. He had moved forward with his life, but the shadow of Jill's murder had never truly disappeared. For the British public, Jill Dando's murder had become a crime that symbolized the fragility of life. A woman who had dedicated her career to helping others, to bringing criminals to justice, had been gunned down on her own doorstep, and no one had been able to explain why. The senseless nature of the crime had struck a chord with many, and despite the passage of time, the desire for justice had never truly waned. Detectives continued to appeal for new information, knowing that time was their greatest enemy. If the killer was still alive, they had managed to evade capture for over 2 decades. If they had confided in anyone, that person had remained silent. And if they had acted alone, they had carried the weight of their crime with them for years without a single misstep. The case remained open, the files still sitting in the archives of Scotland Yard. Every few years, a new investigator would take a fresh look at the evidence, hoping for a breakthrough that had so far eluded them. Until that day came, the mystery of Jill Dando's murder would continue to cast a long shadow over British crime history, a puzzle with missing pieces that no one had been able to find. The truth was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. More than 2 decades had passed since Jill Dando was murdered on her doorstep, and yet the case remained unsolved, a ghost lingering over Britain's collective memory. Despite numerous investigations, arrests, and theories, the person responsible for her death had never been identified. Scotland Yard had exhausted almost every lead, forensic science had evolved dramatically, and yet the crime remained shrouded in darkness. The continued failure to solve the case had led to a growing sense of frustration among detectives, journalists, and members of the public. How could such a high-profile murder, committed in broad daylight in a quiet residential neighborhood, leave so few traces? The answer, many believed, lay in the nature of the crime itself. The killer had executed Jill Dando with chilling precision, firing a single shot to the head before vanishing into thin air. There was no forced entry, no struggle, no clear witness who had seen the shooter's face. The method was so calculated that it had all the hallmarks of a professional assassination. Cold case investigators remained convinced that someone out there knew the truth. Whether it was the killer themselves, a confidant who had harbored a long-buried secret, or a witness who had been too afraid to speak up, the answer had to exist. But as time marched on, the fear grew that it would remain hidden forever. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case was the lack of a clear motive. Detectives had explored every possible angle: revenge, professional rivalry, a stalker's obsession, but none had led to any concrete evidence. Unlike most high-profile murders, where financial disputes, jealousy, or personal vendettas often play a role, Jill's case presented none of these typical patterns. She had no known enemies, no scandalous secrets, and no involvement in dangerous investigations that could have made her a target. If this had been a professional hit, then why? Who had ordered it, and for what reason? As forensic science advanced, investigators re-examined the crime scene, hoping that new technology might yield previously undetectable evidence. But there was still nothing. No DNA, no fingerprints, no stray fibers or hairs. The bullet used to kill Jill was traced to an unusual firearm, a modified pistol with a silencer, but the weapon itself had never been found. It was as if the crime had been meticulously planned to leave behind no leads. The lack of closure continued to haunt Jill's loved ones. Her brother, Nigel Dando, had spent years advocating for justice, appearing in documentaries and interviews to remind the public that his sister's case was still open. He remained convinced that someone out there knew the truth, and that a new witness might one day step forward. But with each passing year, the likelihood of a breakthrough seemed to grow slimmer. Jill's fiancé, Alan Farthing, had tried to move on with his life, but the tragedy had left a lasting scar. Their wedding had been months away when she was killed, and the sudden loss had devastated him. Though he had largely stayed out of the public eye in the years that followed, he had never stopped longing for answers. Over the years, Scotland Yard had issued several fresh appeals for information, urging the public to come forward with anything that might be relevant. They had revisited old witnesses, reanalyzed evidence, and even consulted international law enforcement agencies for potential links to organized crime or foreign intelligence operations. But each time they were met with dead ends. Theories continued to swirl. Some believed Jill had been killed as an act of revenge related to her work on Crime Watch, though no evidence supported this theory. Others insisted that her murder was linked to an unknown personal grudge, yet no suspect with such a motive had ever been identified. The Serbian mafia theory, which had suggested that her killing was retaliation for NATO's involvement in the Kosovo War, remained intriguing but ultimately unsubstantiated. No intelligence agencies had been able to confirm any connections between her death and foreign operatives. For investigators, the most frustrating part of the case was the eerie efficiency with which the crime had been carried out. It suggested a level of planning and execution that was beyond that of a typical spontaneous murder. Whoever had killed Jill had done so in a way that defied conventional detection methods. If it had been a professional hit, the individual responsible had either vanished completely or had been protected by a network of individuals who ensured their silence. Despite the passage of time, Jill Dando's murder remained one of Britain's most infamous unsolved crimes. The public had not forgotten her, and every few years, renewed interest in the case sparked fresh debates and discussions. Documentaries, articles, and investigative specials continued to revisit the case, analyzing every available detail in search of something that had been overlooked. But no matter how many times the case was re-examined, the same question lingered: who killed Jill Dando and why? The case remained open, waiting for the day when a new lead, a confession, or a forgotten piece of evidence would finally bring the truth to light. Until then, the murder of Jill Dando would remain an enduring mystery, a reminder that even in an age of forensic advancements and widespread surveillance, some crimes could still elude justice. The years continued to pass, and yet the murder of Jill Dando remained an open wound in the annals of British crime history. Despite the best efforts of Scotland Yard, multiple reviews of the case, and appeals for information, her killer had never been identified. The weight of the mystery loomed over her family, her friends, and the countless people who had admired her work. The silence surrounding the case was deafening, and it seemed that whoever had committed the crime had vanished without a trace. Investigators had exhausted nearly every possible angle. Every suspect, no matter how remotely connected, had been scrutinized. Every potential motive had been considered and either dismissed or left inconclusive. Theories that had once seemed promising had turned into dead ends, and even the most seasoned detectives found themselves at a loss. How could such a high-profile murder, carried out in broad daylight, remain unsolved for so long? There were some who speculated that the lack of resolution was not due to incompetence or a lack of effort, but rather something more sinister. Had the investigation been misled from the beginning? Had there been an intentional effort to divert attention away from the real killer? These questions lingered in the minds of those who had followed the case closely. The possibility that Jill's murder had been part of something much larger, something obscured from public knowledge, was a chilling thought. Yet, without concrete evidence, these remained little more than unsettling theories. Despite the lack of clear progress, Scotland Yard remained committed to the case. Cold case detectives periodically revisited the evidence, hoping that advances in forensic science might one day provide a breakthrough. The technology available to investigators had evolved dramatically since 1999, and new methods for analyzing trace evidence, digital records, and ballistic comparisons continued to improve. Yet for all the scientific advancements, there was still no DNA, no fingerprints, and no forensic trail to follow. Whoever had killed Jill had done so with remarkable precision, ensuring that their identity would remain hidden. For Jill's loved ones, the passage of time had done little to ease their pain. Her brother, Nigel, had continued to push for answers, refusing to let the case be forgotten. He had spent years advocating for new lines of inquiry, urging law enforcement to keep searching for the truth. Though he understood the challenges detectives faced, he remained convinced that there was someone out there who knew more than they had admitted. Whether it was a witness who had been too afraid to speak, an accomplice who had remained silent, or even the killer themselves, he believed the truth was still waiting to be uncovered. The impact of Jill's murder extended beyond just those who had known her personally. The case had left a lasting imprint on British society, serving as a stark reminder of how even those in the public eye could become victims of inexplicable violence. It had shaken the sense of security that many had once taken for granted, forcing people to confront the unsettling reality that sometimes crimes go unsolved and justice remains elusive. In the years that followed, various media outlets revisited the case, each attempting to piece together the fragments of information in search of an answer. True crime documentaries, investigative articles, and television specials dedicated to Jill's murder attracted widespread interest. Theories were re-examined, old suspects were reconsidered, and new perspectives were explored. But despite the continued fascination with the case, no definitive breakthrough emerged. The questions remained the same. Who had been waiting for Jill on that quiet morning? Who had fired that single shot? And why had they disappeared so seamlessly into the void? With each passing year, the likelihood of solving the case seemed to diminish. Witnesses aged, memories faded, and those who might have once held valuable information had either passed away or chosen to remain silent. The truth, it seemed, was slipping further from reach. But even as hope waned, there were those who refused to accept that Jill's killer would never be found. Detectives still held on to the possibility that a crucial tip might surface, that a piece of overlooked evidence could come to light, or that someone, burdened by guilt or secrecy, would finally break their silence. Until that day came, the murder of Jill Dando remained one of Britain's greatest unsolved mysteries. A case that had defied resolution, confounded experts, and left a nation searching for answers. And so, the shadow of that April morning in 1999 continued to stretch forward, a lingering reminder of justice delayed, but hopefully not denied. The murder of Jill Dando had become one of the most notorious unsolved cases in British history. Each passing year brought renewed frustration and an increasing sense that justice might never be served. Investigators, journalists, and the public alike continued to question how such a brutal, calculated crime could have been committed in broad daylight, in a quiet residential neighborhood, without leaving a single trace of the perpetrator. The lack of progress was both baffling and infuriating. Despite the absence of new leads, Scotland Yard had never officially closed the case. Detectives continued to analyze old evidence, hoping that some overlooked clue might emerge. Advances in forensic technology had solved other long-dormant cases, yet in Jill's case there was still nothing. No DNA, no fingerprints, and no ballistic match for the murder weapon. The crime scene had been eerily clean, as if the killer had been meticulous in ensuring they would never be caught. Over the years, there were occasional flashes of hope. Witnesses came forward with new claims, yet none led to a breakthrough. Some insisted they had seen a shadowy figure loitering near Jill's home on the morning of her murder, while others claimed to have heard confessions from individuals boasting about their involvement. But none of these leads ever panned out, leaving investigators with the same frustrating lack of direction they had faced from the beginning. Speculation about who could have killed Jill remained rampant. Some still believed it was a professional hit, perhaps orchestrated for reasons that had never been fully understood. If that were true, the person who ordered the murder had remained remarkably silent over the years. If someone had wanted Jill silenced, what had she known that posed such a threat? Yet Jill was not an investigative journalist uncovering corruption or criminal networks. She was a television presenter, well loved by the British public, with no known enemies. The lack of motive only deepened the mystery. One of the more disturbing theories involved the possibility that Jill's murderer was someone who had simply chosen her at random. A person driven by an urge to kill, seeking out an opportunity that had presented itself that morning. This theory was unsettling because it meant there was no deeper reason, no conspiracy, just an act of senseless violence. If that was the case, it made the prospect of ever solving the case even more difficult. Without a connection between Jill and her killer, investigators had little to work with. The psychological profile of the killer had been debated by criminologists and forensic experts. If Jill's murder had been premeditated, then the person responsible had likely been watching her for some time. They had known her schedule, waited for the perfect opportunity, and executed the crime without hesitation. But why had they never struck again? Most violent offenders escalate, seeking out new victims or making mistakes that eventually lead to their capture. But Jill's murder stood alone. It was an isolated event with no similar crimes linked to it. With each passing decade, the number of people who had worked on Jill's case within law enforcement dwindled. Retirements, department transfers, and shifting priorities meant that new detectives had to familiarize themselves with a case that had already been extensively investigated, only to reach the same dead end. Despite their determination, the reality was that without a sudden confession or an unexpected new piece of evidence, the case would remain frozen in time. Jill's family had long accepted the possibility that they might never get the closure they so desperately sought. Her brother, Nigel Dando, continued to speak out, urging anyone with information to come forward. Though he had made peace with the fact that Jill was gone, he refused to let her story be forgotten. Her fiancé, Alan Farthing, had eventually moved on with his life, but the pain of losing Jill so suddenly had left an imprint that could never truly fade. For the public, Jill Dando's murder had become a symbol of the unknowable, an event that defied logic and explanation. It was a reminder that sometimes, no matter how much effort is put into an investigation, some crimes remain unsolved. Theories would continue to emerge, discussions would persist, and journalists would keep revisiting the case, but the truth remained elusive. There were still those who believed that one day, the answer would come. Perhaps a deathbed confession, a hidden piece of evidence, or a breakthrough in forensic science would finally bring Jill's killer to justice. Until that day arrived, however, the murder of Jill Dando remained one of the greatest mysteries in British criminal history, a case that had defied resolution for more than 2 decades. As the years continued to pass, the unsolved murder of Jill Dando remained an enigma that refused to fade from the public's consciousness. It was a case that should have been solvable. One of the most famous television personalities in Britain, murdered in broad daylight on her own doorstep. Yet no answers had ever emerged. Despite the passage of time, Scotland Yard refused to close the case entirely. Cold case detectives periodically re-examined the evidence, hoping that advances in forensic technology might provide a long-awaited breakthrough. The hope was that something, perhaps a microscopic trace of DNA, a new method of ballistic analysis, or a long-forgotten piece of surveillance footage, would reveal the identity of the person who had fired that single fatal shot. But time and time again, these re-examinations led nowhere. The case file remained open, but with each passing year, the likelihood of a resolution seemed to slip further away. The psychological aspect of the crime continued to baffle experts. Jill had no known enemies. She was widely regarded as kind, compassionate, and universally liked. If the killer had been motivated by revenge or personal grievance, no evidence of such a conflict had ever come to light. If it had been a case of mistaken identity, why had no one ever come forward to admit their intended target had been someone else? If it had been a contract killing, who had ordered it, and what had Jill done to warrant such a fate? The eerie precision of the crime led some to believe it had been the work of a professional assassin. The use of a silencer, the single point-blank shot, and the immediate disappearance of the perpetrator all suggested an experienced hand. If this theory were true, it raised an unsettling question. Had Jill stumbled into something she should not have? Some speculated that her work on Crime Watch, where she helped expose unsolved crimes, may have placed her in the crosshairs of a criminal organization. But thorough investigations into this possibility had turned up no concrete evidence. One of the most enduring theories remained that Jill had been targeted by a deranged individual who had developed an unhealthy obsession with her. Stalkers had been known to fixate on public figures, sometimes with tragic consequences. However, Jill had never reported receiving threats or feeling unsafe. She had lived her life without visible signs of fear, making it seem unlikely that she had been knowingly pursued by an unknown individual. Her brother, Jill Dando, continued to hope that answers would one day come. Over the years, he had participated in multiple media appeals, urging anyone with knowledge of the case to come forward. His efforts had kept Jill's story alive, ensuring that the investigation remained on the minds of both the public and law enforcement. Despite his determination, he knew that the chances of a breakthrough were slim. If someone had information that could solve the case, why had they remained silent for so long? Alan Farthing, Jill's fiancé at the time of her murder, had spent years trying to rebuild his life. Though he had eventually moved on, the sudden and brutal loss of Jill had left a permanent mark on him. The future they had planned together had been stolen in an instant, leaving only unanswered questions and an aching absence that could never be filled. Public interest in the case had not waned. Documentaries, books, and investigative specials continued to revisit Jill's murder, each hoping to uncover something new. True crime enthusiasts dissected every available detail, theorizing about possible suspects and overlooked evidence. But for all the speculation, there was no clear resolution. The longer the case remained unsolved, the more it cemented itself as one of the great mysteries of British crime history. Each year brought renewed media attention, and yet the same haunting questions remained. Who had killed Jill Dando? Why had they chosen her? And how had they managed to evade justice for so long? Law enforcement still held on to the possibility that a crucial piece of information might one day surface. Perhaps a witness would come forward with a memory they had buried. Perhaps the killer, or someone close to them, would be unable to keep the secret any longer. Perhaps advances in forensic science would finally expose the truth that had remained hidden for so long. But until that moment arrived, the murder of Jill Dando would remain an unresolved tragedy, an enduring symbol of justice delayed, and a stark reminder that some crimes defy explanation. For Jill's family, her friends, and the public who had admired her, the hope remained that one day, the truth would emerge. Until then, the shadow of that fateful April morning would continue to loom over British criminal history, an open wound that time alone could not heal. As time marched on, the case of Jill Dando's murder remained one of the most baffling and unsettling mysteries in British history. Despite the advances in forensic science, renewed appeals for information, and continued media attention, no solid leads had emerged. The silence surrounding the case was as impenetrable as ever. For detectives who had worked on the case, the frustration was immeasurable. The fact that no physical evidence had been left behind at the scene suggested an almost surgical precision in the execution of the crime. The lack of a murder weapon, the absence of eyewitnesses who had seen the perpetrator clearly, and the inability to tie any suspect conclusively to the crime all made it a seemingly unsolvable case. And yet, it was precisely the professional nature of the murder that kept leading investigators back to the idea that this had been an orchestrated hit rather than a crime of impulse. The sheer randomness of the crime continued to trouble those closest to Jill. If she had been targeted, then why? If it had been a case of mistaken identity, why had the killer never struck again? And if the attack had been the work of a deranged individual, how had they managed to carry out the killing so cleanly and then disappear without leaving a trace? These questions had plagued detectives from the start, and even now, over 2 decades later, they remained unanswered. Despite the lack of developments, there was always the hope that someone, somewhere, held a crucial piece of information. Investigators believed that, over time, people who had remained silent out of fear or loyalty might eventually feel compelled to speak. Whether it was a small detail that had previously seemed insignificant or a direct admission from someone who had been withholding information, it was possible that a new lead could still surface. Public interest in Jill's case had not waned. Periodically, the media revisited the story, analyzing old evidence and interviewing key figures in an effort to keep the case alive. True crime enthusiasts dissected the available details, discussing theories ranging from politically motivated assassinations to revenge killings by an unknown enemy. The public fascination with the case was fueled not only by Jill's status as a beloved television personality, but also by the eerie manner in which the crime had been committed. Jill's family continued to hold out hope that justice would one day be served. Her brother, Jill Dando, remained one of the strongest advocates for keeping her memory alive. He had spent years campaigning for further investigations, refusing to accept that the case would remain unsolved forever. To him, the notion that someone had been able to commit such a horrific crime and walk away unpunished was intolerable. For Jill's fiancé, Alan Farthing, the loss had changed the course of his life. The future they had planned together had been stolen in an instant, and he had been left to navigate a reality in which she was no longer by his side. Over time, he had found a way to move forward, but the weight of what had happened never fully left him. Theories about Jill's murder continued to circulate, though none had been definitively proven. Some still believed that she had been assassinated due to her involvement in Crime Watch, where she had worked on cases exposing criminals and seeking justice for victims. Others maintained that it was an international hit, linked to her coverage of humanitarian crises. And then there were those who believed it had been the work of a lone individual, someone who had harbored a fixation on Jill and acted upon their dark obsession. Despite the endless speculation, the case remained where it had always been, open, but with no clear path forward. Scotland Yard had not given up, though the reality was that without new evidence or a confession, the likelihood of solving the murder became slimmer with each passing year. But history had shown that even the coldest cases could eventually be solved. Witnesses who had once remained silent had, in other cases, come forward years later. Advances in forensic science had cracked cases that had long been thought unsolvable. And sometimes guilt had a way of catching up with people, leading them to confess after decades of silence. Until that day arrived, however, Jill Dando's murder would remain an open wound in Britain's criminal history. The questions persisted. Who had waited for Jill outside her home that day? Who had taken her life with such brutal efficiency? And would the truth ever be known? For now, the case of Jill Dando remained one of the great mysteries of British crime. A case that, despite the best efforts of law enforcement, had managed to slip through the cracks of justice. The hope that one day the truth would emerge remained alive. But for those who had known and loved Jill, each passing year without answers only deepened the pain of her loss. As time passed, the case of Jill Dando remained one of Britain's most perplexing unsolved crimes. Despite continued efforts by investigators, forensic experts, and journalists, her killer had never been identified. The frustration of not knowing what had happened to her weighed heavily on her loved ones, while the public remained fixated on the mystery surrounding her murder. The renewed interest in the case that would surface every few years kept hope alive that someone, somewhere, might come forward with the missing piece of the puzzle. Cold case units at Scotland Yard periodically reviewed the evidence, checking for any new scientific methods that could be applied to old forensic materials. Yet, every attempt to extract new leads from the existing evidence had failed. The crime scene had been eerily devoid of usable forensic clues, reinforcing the belief that this had been a meticulously planned attack. One of the most widely debated aspects of the case was the professional nature of the murder. The fact that Jill had been killed with a single shot, fired at close range with a silenced weapon, led many to believe this was the work of an experienced assassin. However, if this were true, the biggest question remained: who would have ordered such an execution and why? Jill's work as a television presenter did not place her in direct conflict with dangerous individuals, at least not to the extent that warranted an assassination. The possibility of an obsessed stalker remained a disturbing but plausible theory. Public figures often attract unwanted attention from individuals who develop fixations on them. Could someone have been watching Jill, studying her routine, waiting for the right moment to strike? If so, why had no threats been made in the weeks or months leading up to her death? No letters, no phone calls, no evidence of direct harassment had ever been discovered. If Jill had been targeted by someone with an unhealthy obsession, they had managed to remain completely undetected both before and after the crime. Another avenue that continued to intrigue investigators was the theory of a politically motivated hit. Some believed that Jill had been killed as a form of retaliation for British involvement in international conflicts, particularly the NATO-led intervention in Kosovo. Jill had been involved in charity work for Kosovan refugees, and some suspected that this had made her a target. However, there was never any hard evidence linking her murder to foreign operatives or political motivations. Intelligence agencies had investigated this possibility, but had found no credible connections. As the years went on, those closest to Jill continued to struggle with the absence of answers. Her brother, Jill Dando, had made it his mission to ensure that Jill's case was never forgotten. He had spoken publicly on numerous occasions, urging anyone with information to come forward. Despite his efforts, no new revelations had emerged. The pain of losing his sister in such a violent and senseless manner had never faded, and the lack of justice only made it worse. For Jill's fiancé, Alan Farthing, the grief was just as enduring. The two had been planning a wedding, a future together, and in an instant, it had all been taken away. The trauma of losing Jill in such an unexpected way had left a deep mark on him, one that time had not entirely healed. Like Nigel, Alan had hoped that answers would eventually come, that closure could be found. But as the years continued to pass with no resolution, that hope had begun to wane. Public fascination with Jill's murder remained as strong as ever. Documentaries, news specials, and online discussions frequently revisited the case, offering new theories and revisiting old ones. Despite the extensive coverage, none of these efforts brought forward new evidence. The mystery had captured the imagination of the public, but even the most diligent investigators had been unable to crack the case. One of the most disheartening aspects of the investigation was that Jill's murder had seemingly been the only crime of its kind. If her killer had been a professional hitman, why had no similar murders occurred? If it had been a random act of violence, why had there been no other victims? The complete lack of comparable crimes made it difficult for investigators to establish a pattern, leaving them with only speculation and unanswered questions. In recent years, police had once again called for anyone with information, no matter how small, to come forward. Detectives remained convinced that someone out there knew more than they had admitted. Perhaps it was a witness who had seen something but didn't realize its significance. Perhaps it was someone who had heard a confession but had chosen to remain silent out of fear or loyalty. Whatever the case, the hope was that time would eventually loosen lips and reveal the truth. For now, the murder of Jill Dando remained an open case, an unsolved crime that had defied every attempt at resolution. The frustration of not knowing, of having no definitive answers, continued to haunt those who had loved her. Until the day came when the truth was finally revealed, Jill's murder would remain one of Britain's most haunting mysteries. A chilling reminder of how even the most seemingly straightforward crimes can elude justice for decades. Decades had passed since the shocking murder of Jill Dando, yet the case remained as cold as ever. Every theory, every piece of evidence, and every suspect had been examined and re-examined, but no conclusive answers had emerged. The truth remained just out of reach, a puzzle missing its final, crucial pieces. For Jill's family and friends, the pain of losing her had never fully faded. Time had moved forward, but the wounds left by her untimely death remained open. Her brother, Jill Dando, had fought tirelessly to keep her memory alive and to push for further investigation. Though he had come to accept that the case might never be solved, he refused to give up entirely. He remained convinced that someone out there knew the truth, and that one day, perhaps by sheer chance, new information would surface. Jill's fiancé, Alan Farthing, had also carried the weight of her loss for years. Their future together had been cruelly stolen, and though he had moved on with his life, the specter of Jill's murder still lingered. The fact that justice had never been served only made the tragedy more difficult to bear. He had long since given up hope that the case would ever be solved, but the questions remained. Despite the lack of resolution, Jill's legacy endured. She had been more than just a television presenter. She had been a beacon of professionalism, kindness, and dedication. Her work on Crime Watch had helped countless victims find justice, and in a cruel twist of fate, she had become the subject of the very kind of case she had sought to bring closure to. The case file remained open at Scotland Yard, though active investigation efforts had largely dwindled. Advances in forensic science continued to offer a faint glimmer of hope, but unless new evidence was discovered, the likelihood of an arrest seemed slim. Cold case detectives still periodically reviewed Jill's murder, hoping that one day, a breakthrough would emerge. The public, too, remained captivated by the mystery. True crime documentaries, investigative articles, and online discussions continued to analyze every detail, searching for answers that had eluded law enforcement for so long. Theories varied wildly. Some still believed it had been a professional hit. Others insisted it was a crime of opportunity carried out by a lone attacker. With so little concrete evidence, the case remained open to speculation. Every few years, a renewed public appeal would be made, urging anyone with information to come forward. But so far, no new witnesses had emerged, no confessions had been made, and no forensic breakthroughs had cracked the case wide open. It seemed as though Jill's murderer had disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind only pain, confusion, and unanswered questions. As time went on, one question remained. Would the truth ever come to light? Would a witness step forward with long-held knowledge? Would a deathbed confession reveal the identity of the killer? Would a chance discovery in an old archive finally connect the missing pieces? For now, the murder of Jill Dando remained one of the most infamous unsolved cases in British history. It was a case that had frustrated detectives, mystified the public, and left those who had loved Jill searching for justice that had never come. Until the day arrived when the truth was finally uncovered, her murder would remain an enduring mystery. A case frozen in time, waiting for the moment when the final piece of the puzzle would finally fall into place.